so glad to see all of you. It's a special volunteer appreciation gathering and history tidbits. Our volunteer docents are the heart of our museum and visitor center, and we continue to get great feedback from visitors that sign in. I personally think of our docents as Tryon ambassadors because they are the ones that share the unique character and interesting history of Tryon to visitors and newcomers that have moved to our area. Now for some statistics. In 2022, we had about 1,025 visitors compared to 795 in 2021 because we were getting back into the groove after 2020. Somebody was asking, can we have a repeat of, can we return that year and get another year back? That's the only way to do it. Our volunteer hours in 2022 were about 1,030, which at the current estimated national value of volunteer hours is about $30 an hour. So that value is about, for our volunteer docent hours is about $30,000.
Wow.
Just this past January, which can be a very quiet month, our volunteers clocked in 50 hours with 67 visitors compared to 31 in 2021. Even in January, we had people thank us for being open because so many places are closed. So when I was here on a Saturday, somebody came in, "You're open." And we said, "Yes, we are." Some verbal comments and some comments written down in our visitor sign-in book. Quaint town, saw the sign from Trade Street, we love Morris the horse. Enchanted by the Tryon Toymaker collection, very friendly and helpful staff. Love your charming town, fascinating Tryon history. It's so good to be back home in Tryon. A lot of people, when they're visiting or coming back, enjoy the Nina Simone display. Really like to visit museums and towns and love the equestrian history. At our Christmas stroll, some people were saying, because we had intimate lighting like Biltmore with the battery operated candles safely, people were saying it was cozy and an intimate museum. And again, we love Tryon history. You hear that a lot. I bet Julia hears that all the time.
All the time.
Yes.
It's wonderful.
The people that come in, not only visitors, but people that live in town that are looking for literature for when their family or friends are coming in. They really enjoy the fact that we have the brochures and maps and literature of scenic points of interest and the galleries and hiking trails, restaurants, wineries, and antiques in our area. Some of the sample visitors from a variety of states, South Carolina, North Carolina, Wisconsin, New Hampshire, Virginia, Washington State, Florida, California, New York, Washington, D.C., Minnesota, Iowa, Michigan, Illinois, and some countries, England, Germany, Italy, and Paris, France. A reminder, we always are in need of docents, and we ask that you commit to at least one slot of 2.5 hours a month. We especially need help on Fridays and Saturdays, which are the days that we have the highest traffic count. And then in the summer, then Wednesdays and Thursdays really pick up too. You don't have to be an expert on Tryon history. What we need are enthusiastic and interested volunteers that are willing to make use of our wonderful reference books that we have and to share what you've learned with visitors that come in. We always offer orientation so you wouldn't be on your own the first couple of times, and we'll be willing to stay with you. Now our president, Dick Calloway, will have a few words before I will introduce Mike McCue.
Thank you, Joy. This is very nice, and we're glad everybody can be here today. And just don't have the words to express how much we appreciate those of you who have helped us with the museum, help keep the doors open. We need more. If you can spread the word, please do. But so pleased with what all of you present have done. Now, I need to make another announcement on a special plea. Our Tales of Tryon series is, I think, maybe the best thing we've had going for us. And Julia's nodding her head enthusiastically, so I'm always glad to have it confirmed. Thank you, Julia. I don't know what's happened to our daily bulletin announcements, though. The past 2 issues are supposed to have had something about the Tales in them, and they haven't. So here we are with the Tales presentation Wednesday night, and we're going to have to hope, Wanda, maybe they need an extra cattle prodding, that something gets in the paper on Wednesday. Because we have a very exciting program. We have Dr. Steve Nash from East Tennessee State University, who actually lives in Weaverville. He's written, as some of you probably have read his book, Reconstruction's Ragged Edge, which deals with the Reconstruction era in Western North Carolina. He's going to focus this talk, I believe, on 2 characters. One was a newspaper editor in Rutherford County. Help me out, Mike.
Randolph Shotwell.
Randolph Shotwell. And the other one is Virgil Lusk, who eventually became the mayor of Asheville. But Lusk, they were both Confederate officers. Lusk became a Republican after the war, and Shotwell remained a convinced conservative or Democrat. Shotwell sneaks up on Lusk in the town public square in Asheville and canes him. So Lusk, in return, shoots Shotwell in both legs. And Steve Nash can tell you the rest of the story. And it may have some overtones in Polk County. It will. But I'll talk with you about that later, Julie. You may know something I need to know there. And Mike and I have talked about it. Anyway, I won't go on about that, but it is going to be held at the depot at 5 o'clock this Wednesday. Steve teaches classes on Thursday, so he couldn't be here, but we are going to have to probably accept the Tales are going to move around some in terms of venue and exact times and days we hold it. We're willing to work with the good speakers that we're trying to accommodate them. But we've been pleased with the turnouts. We averaged about 85 people per session last year. And we're a little bit disappointed, and certainly I take some of the blame for it, for not getting word out sooner, and we're going to try to do better about that and hold a presentation roughly every other month this year, and then hope we can step this up in terms of quantity next year. But you have quantity to consider, you have quality to consider, and I'm not willing to sacrifice the quality. But we're very well pleased with the support we've gotten for this, and we're very well pleased with the volunteer efforts of all of you. Glad to see you here today, and I will let Joy introduce my good friend Mike McCue that we're honored to have.
Yes,
I would just like to
yes,
point out that if you weren't able to attend the Tales of Tryon in the past, they have been recorded and they are up on the YouTube channel for the Tryon History Museum.
Thank you very much for saying
Thank
that,
you.
Ellen. Yes, that's important.
I'll repeat that
And
again.
thank you for all the help you've given us with it.
Ellen Thomas, our great archivist, video recorder, media person, has put everything in. So if you go to the website, tryonhistory.org.
Tryon History Museum on YouTube.
On the YouTube. Okay, that's
Tryon
great.
History
Thank you.
Museum, yeah.
Thank you for reminding us that. All right, so now our introduction for Mike McCue. Months ago, Ellen Thomas, my husband Jerry, and I were brainstorming some ideas for making training videos for docents and visitors. Not training our visitors, but informational videos. Then Jerry mentioned that we need to do something special only for the docents, something that will be unique and something that they will look forward to, and more intimate and not so crowded, because our tales are always so popular. And so the brainstorming continued, and then I thought, oh, what would be the best hook to get our docents in besides food?
Food is number one.
What would it be? And so I mentioned to Mike, saying, you know, Ellen, Thomas, and Jerry, you know, we were brainstorming and we want something special for the docents. And would you do something for us for the Toymakers and possibly the Tryon Vineyards? So Mike graciously said yes. And so we have Mike McCue here, and he's just a wealth of information, and his enthusiasm is very contagious for history in our area, especially our Tryon history. So take it away,
Well,
Mike
thank you.
McCue.
And I'm just going to sit here. I did not agree to give a speech.
Right, right.
But I did agree to come because it was so attractive, the idea of having folks gather around today who really are interested in history. And I know everyone in this room is very interested sincerely in history, what we can learn, and how this work that's going on here to welcome visitors, help them understand their heritage. It's really important, and so it's really special to me to have the opportunity to talk with you today about two important topics in Tryon history. One is the grapes, and another is the Toymakers. Because they're pretty misunderstood. There's a lot going around about those two topics that's just legend. And what we do here as historians and history buffs is to really try to learn what the real story is, because it's always more interesting. It really is. It's always more interesting than the legend. And it's usually more complex than the legend. And I guess it makes me feel really good to know that you guys share those ideas, that you're not just here for entertainment, that you really do want to know more, and you want to share the right story when people come in. Both of these topics, actually in my mind, have a common theme. And that common theme is idealism, believe it or not. And so what I'm going to get into a little bit here is motivations, reasons that these things came about in this particular place, so that you'll have a deeper understanding, that you'll go beyond just what happened, but why it happened. Let's start with grapes. Everybody, think about, in your own mind, why do we grow grapes?
Food.
Wine.
I know what you're thinking. We all have baggage as we look to the past. Most grape growing today is about making wine. In the history of Tryon, that is not why grapes were grown. The beginning of the grape industry had nothing to do with wine. That was not the objective. Really? In fact, before Prohibition, there was only one winemaker here, and that winemaker never achieved their objective. And yet in the year 1999, 1899, excuse me, 1899. 200,000 pounds of grapes left on the trains out of the depot, and 10,000 pounds of grapes were sold through the windows of the trains to the people waiting to go up to the salute grave. 210,000 pounds of grapes in 1 year. Those were all table grapes. And you guys are interested in the context of what was happening about that time, the temperance movement. And in 1903, North Carolina passed the Watts Law, which severely hampered the sale of any alcoholic beverage. And in 1908, the voters of this state voted total prohibition. So it's not about making wine. Now there is a story to wine that is after prohibition, but you guys are interested in how did it begin? As a matter of fact, North Carolina was at one time the biggest wine growing state. Winemaking state. But that's before Tryon got started. And we all know that Tryon got started in 1877 when the railroad built this spot, reached this spot, and the first depot was built. That is key, because grapes are highly perishable, and to get this product out, you needed to get it out fast to market. And so the access of the grape growers to rail shipment was a big deal. It was necessary for Tryon's grape success to have this shipping here. And so there would be carloads of table grapes that would go to Augusta and Atlanta and Philadelphia and all over the place, because of the railroads. And we all know who McAvoy was, right? Anybody here not know who McAvoy was? McAvoy, the Mimosa started as McAvoy's Resort. He was a Presbyterian minister who in 1870 came here with his son-in-law, Wilcox, who laid out Tryon City. He was a Presbyterian minister, but he did not start a Presbyterian church here. He was also a medical doctor. And most interestingly, McAvoy was a correspondent with the Agriculture Department in Washington. He was terrifically interested in agriculture. His 1880 report to the Agriculture Department says, "The grapes grow wild here. They grow in abundance. I have a mountainside where you can just go out there and just grab the grapes and eat them." And as a matter of fact, there are some people who kind of make wine out of it, but that was not the point. What he came here for was in the interest of social service. Llewellyn Reed McAvoy was really a remarkable man. And before he moved down here, anybody heard of Delia Mills? You have. Delia Mills was one of the slaves on the old Columbus Mills plantation. He brought her up to Pittsburgh where he was living, and she lived in his household to prepare the way for a mission activity that took place here, where Llewellyn Reed McAvoy and his people were going to make this a better place. This is a week to talk about Reconstruction, isn't it, Dick?
Yes.
The coincidence is simply amazing. We're going to be talking about Reconstruction. And what went on in Polk County during Reconstruction was very different from what went on in most places. Were these Yankees carpetbaggers? No, not as far as the local people were concerned. People here saw these people coming in with money and expertise as an opportunity to better themselves. And so a big idea that Wilcox had, that Llewellyn Reed McAvoy had, and all those people that came along with them to here was, let's make it a model place for how Reconstruction ought to take place. They didn't come here for the money. They came here to make it a better place. Well, one of the issues was, what are you going to do for the people, especially the black people, who don't have any land? Grapes provided an opportunity for employment for black people. You have never heard that idea before, have you? Well, hear it from me, because I've been researching this, and I know it's true. We found a list of who had vineyards in 1894. Who were these people? They were people from the north with money who wanted to improve the United States and to specifically address the enormous needs of the South. And one of those needs was, what can the black people do? Growing cotton was not going to solve the problem. More rice, more sugar cane. As a matter of fact, when Wilcox got here, one of their first ideas was, let's grow hemp. Because they had a major hemp factory in Pittsburgh that what do you make out of hemp? You make rope, right? That's what you made out of hemp back then. You made rope. That was an enormously important product for industry. And so there is great evidence that they first introduced the idea, oh, let's go to the Mills plantation and get all the black people to make hemp. Well, if you know about that, it's nasty, dirty work, and the black people didn't want to do that. Mm-hmm. So they got that idea. But then people got interested in fruit growing, and in the 1880s, it was found that this vicinity was very good for fruits. They started growing peaches, pears, plums, strawberries commercially, and they could grow grapes commercially. Now, another great big thing about grapes is, where do they do best? Bottomlands?
Hillside.
Hillsides! Scrubby hillsides. The stonier, the better. The Doubleday Vineyard, which was our biggest vineyard here, was on the worst land. You could buy land cheap down here if it was on a hillside. It was no good for growing corn, certainly no good for growing cotton. And so these people came in and bought the hillsides that hadn't really been used for agriculture before. Sometimes they'd logged it off and then it was really worthless. And, I'm not making this up. It's actually in the primary sources that Mr. Doubleday said, my best grapes come from my worst land. My stony, rocky land. This is fun. This was published by the history people in Raleigh. And it's about one of the early folks here in Tryon. He died in Tryon City in 1891. His name was Mortimer Heath. He was son of a Anglican minister in England who came during Reconstruction in the 1870s to North Carolina. And he learned the grape business. Now, why would you do that? If you're a young man from, well-off family in England, why would you go to North Carolina? Think about it. Why would you do that? And work in the vineyards and at the wine place? It's because you have a social purpose. And Mortimer Heath liked to sketch, he liked to draw, and he sent back to his family in England his drawings of what was going on in the vineyard in Halifax County, North Carolina. And as you go through this book, you see all these black people. And you see all these white people. And they're working together to grow the grapes. There was a Christian overtone to this. Laboring in the vineyards, you've heard the phrase? It's got a positive Christian overtone. It was noble work. Growing cotton was not noble work. Growing grapes was noble work. And like many late 19th century people, he got tuberculosis. He died at 37 here. This was a man with a social purpose in coming here.
Trying to stay warm.
That's okay,
I'm trying to stay back together. Excuse me.
Has anybody heard of Helen Carver? Julia's heard of Helen Carver. She came in 1895. She was from Minnesota. She was fresh out of Stanford University. She came from a moneyed family. Her father was a leading lawyer in Minnesota. And she spent the rest of her life here. And she bought the Hadley Vineyard that had already been developed, that is on the site of what is now Tryon Elementary School. And it stretched all the way from the railroad tracks down to what's now 176, and she stayed here the rest of her life. Why was she here? It was a social purpose. I can't tell you about every person who came here and ran a vineyard, but you're beginning to see the pattern. Who was Ulysses Doubleday? Betty Frost's grandfather, who she liked to credit with starting the industry here. Who was he? Anybody know?
He was Abner Doubleday's brother, wasn't he?
He was Abner Doubleday's brother. He fought in the Civil War. And what did he do in the Civil War? He commanded a troop of colored soldiers. He was very interested in black people. And as we commemorate Black History Month, here we sit and we talk about grapes. There's a connection here. It's very important to understand this. The Hadley Vineyard, who Helen Carver bought her vineyard from, had been developed by a man from Rochester, New York. Rochester, you know, Skip, was where you bought a lot of seeds and a lot of plants, and there was a great interest in scientific agriculture there. And when Joseph Hadley, no, that's Joseph Lucky, who came from Rochester, excuse me. He was interested in these things. And there's some evidence that he had tuberculosis also. So by coming down here at a time when fresh air, sunshine, and a more moderate climate was considered, see, they didn't understand what caused tuberculosis when these guys came. They only found that out about 1900. That was, where they come from. But there were actually people who came down here suffering from consumption who actually got better here. I don't think that if you really had tuberculosis, you were going to get better, but there were a lot of people who lived in smoky cities like Pittsburgh that once they showed up here, they really did get better and go back. The first lawyer, Clark Jordan, here he developed Godshaw Hill with Whitney. He came here as a young man with terrible consumption. He was here for 6 years and he got so much better he could go back to New York. He was cured. And so a lot of people with consumption came here for that reason. And the man from Rochester, though he died when he was 53 and his wife died when she was 47, them here running a vineyard. And I remember when I was talking with George Ade, who as a boy actually lived in a vineyard in Panglow Valley, I said, who did the work? His father was an artist. He said, the black people. Oh, really? Never heard about that before. Nobody's written it up in history. So how much, that was 15 minutes on grapes, right? How grapes got started?
So Mike,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
have, this is sketches then.
This is sketches. And what's really interesting, Joy, is when you look at Mortimer Heath's sketches, you actually see some with just blacks. You see some where blacks and whites are working together in the vineyard. Isn't that interesting?
Oh, this
In the
is a
South.
treasure.
Take a look at it. It's really neat.
It's called Sketches in North Carolina, USA,
Yeah.
1872 to 1878, Vineyard Scenes by Mortimer O. Heath.
And what really I get a kick out of this because it's so Raleigh. They have no idea what Tryon is. Yeah. It says the guy died in Tryon City in 1891, and we think it was a place where tuberculars went. They have no idea there were grapes here. Because, they're
Well,
Raleigh.
you
They don't
can't
know
help
these
it, they're
things.
from Raleigh.
They're from
When I was trying to explain to my brother when we found Tryon about 32 years ago, and he lives in Raleigh, and he worked for the state, he was a state investigator. And I was trying to explain to him about Tryon. Well, Marty, I've been to all the courthouses in North Carolina, and I don't know Tryon. And I says, well, there's a courthouse in Columbus. Well, we have to come check out Tryon. Well,
Yeah.
once they came to Tryon, then of course they loved Tryon. They bought property in Tryon. So we do, like to educate
5
our
more
Raleigh
minutes on
people.
grapes. Maybe 5 more minutes on grapes.
It's a wonderful book.
So anyway, so you had a number of people, many from New England, New York, some from the South. Lindsay was from Frankfort, Kentucky, who had these big vineyards. Now, you plant the vines. Do you know how long it takes before you get grapes?
3 years.
5 years. And they began to do scientific grapes which involved trellising, the Kniffen system. K-N-I-F-F-I-N was first used here by Eugene Thomas, who was a retired naval commander. And his house was the Washburn place there on 108, and his vineyard was where all the bamboo is down by Packwood River, just across. That was the Thomas vineyard where that technique was first used. Well, that took investment, and it took a tremendous amount of labor. You could grow an awful lot of grapes on an acre, But the labor and the investment and the waiting, ordinary farmers couldn't do that. It took people with capital to come in and do that. And then after 5 years, you know, the prices got really volatile. And, you know, there's the panic of 1893, and nobody had any money, and so the harvest was bad in 94, and, you know, prices were down in 94. I mean, you had to be somebody who could withstand reversal in this grape business. This was not for people who were doing subsistence farming. And it certainly isn't how you got to be rich. So it was essentially done for some higher purpose. Then you had our prohibition and national prohibition, and there was winemaking going on, but it was not commercial. Oh, I should mention the Lamore and Goulet.
Please,
Everybody's heard of that. Okay, so there was one winemaker before prohibition that was a collaboration of brothers-in-law, Mr. Lamore and Mr. Goulet, who were buried in Tryon Cemetery, as I recall. One of them was from Switzerland, one of them was from France, and they wanted to make wine. And it was legal when they came in the 1890s. They did sell some. It was packaged in jugs, but this Watt's Law essentially forbade that after 1903. And so they continued to grow table grapes, but the wine business did not get big before Prohibition. Then after Prohibition was over, we had about 3 winemakers here, and that's all. The first one was Dr. Fuldner's, that was called Falerno, and it was named for the Falerno wine district of Italy, where he'd spent some time. Dr. Fuldner was a physician from Milwaukee. He was a psychiatrist, and his wife was very theatrical. And they had this vineyard up on Meadowlark. And so they were the first ones to get the permit. And they bottled wine, and there's an original bottle of that full of the wine at Polk County History Museum in Columbus. And then there was Vollmer, who's mentioned here. He came in 1924 from Germany to grow table grapes, which continued to be raised during Prohibition, and he got a permit and sold wine. And then, help me out, what was the other one or two? Lindsay? I think Lindsay after Prohibition.
Yeah.
There was a short window of time there between like 33, 43, when they were making some wine. But it wasn't a big factor.
What about the one off of Melrose back by Lynn Court there?
Yes, that was the Whitney vineyard.
Okay, that was Whitney.
That was one of the very earliest ones.
Okay, that was Whitney.
The
Time for
Alston vineyard
Yes,
was
sir.
near the railroad track on Godshaw. Yeah.
any, time for any questions or?
Sure, questions before we get off grapes? Yes,
Just
one.
one quick one. What killed the grape industry in Tryon? Was it technology or something else?
2 major factors. From what we can tell, the fungus really was the worst. The black rock fungus was already present by the late 1890s, and by 1900, they were already trying to figure out how to save the Alston vineyard. And they would spray it with copper and some other things, but it just became like so much spraying. And
Was it the humidity that caused the fungus?
humidity has a great deal to do with the fungus. Yeah. And as a matter of fact, here, it was drier than it was, say, in eastern North Carolina, where that vineyard had been,
Right.
where that guy came from. But California was the best,
Yeah.
because it really is dry. And so the grapes would grow, but the fungus would get it. So what happened to the Alston vineyard, for example, is that they just stopped growing grapes there. They went to fruits, and they were fine. The other factor that I think is really major is the labor. Grapes are so labor intensive. And the original idea was to provide employment to people, especially black people. And many black people developed terrific expertise in that cultivation. But there were other opportunities for black people that were very attractive in Tryon. One was the railroad work. The railroad work was good, especially on the Pullmans. A related industry was the hospitality industry. And we know that the restaurants and hotels employed black people. Some people, being right on the railroad, blacks here were very mobile. And there were quite a few blacks who went elsewhere. Say like they would be rooted here but work in the sanitariums in Asheville, come back here on weekends. And then the equestrian industry, when it took off, it provided a lot of employment to black people. And some of it was pretty neat, there were white people working in the vineyards, but really most white people wanted to own land and kind of do their own farming, I guess is the way to put it. And of course, black people were excluded from mills, so when you started up the hosiery mill in 1896, your workforce was the non-landed white people. That was true throughout the South. They would come and work in the mills, and that was not the case with black people. They did not have those opportunities. Other factors, well, you really didn't make money growing grapes, or even making wine. And after a while, what do when you have one of these kind of prestigious businesses, but it doesn't make you any money? You sort of transition out.
They were aging out too, but
Yes.
the younger generation did not want to take in all the work for the little money.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, it just didn't pay. So there are a lot of really interesting characters who were viticulturists here, and each of them have a fascinating story. I could do this for another hour, Ellen, but we
Well,
don't
the
have
H.L.
time.
Moore Vineyard out at House Corner Bridge on the Packard, the last one, 'cause it was there in the 50s.
Yeah.
Was that the last one?
Which one? What was that called?
H.L. Moore had one out there.
Moore.
Out Packard Valley, where the bridge is, in Hardersville.
Yeah, I see.
And that-
It kind of whimpered and died about then.
Yeah, and
It-
Walmer went
He has a pretty
until,
big vineyard out there.
yeah, Mr. Walmer went until what, the early 60s, huh?
Lullwater was one of the late ones. Yeah. 40s, everybody could tell it was going on. 50s was really the last gasp.
Yeah.
On the wine.
Does anybody remember those little Delaware grapes, little red, that's the best one.
Oh, that's another thing to know. Everybody wants to know what was the variety. Anybody know? It was the Niagara. Most of your grape juice, your white grape juice, is still Niagara. And, I gotta tell you this. In 1897, they built a bottling plant here in Tryon to bottle grape juice. And it was called the Packard Grape Juice Company. And it was carbonated. And they had a capacity of 3,000 gallons a day. There were so many grapes floating around. I mean, already by 1897, there's just thousands and thousands of pounds of grapes. How do you get them out here fast enough and get them to market in time? And the nice thing about, again, this took capital, right? To build this big plant and to have all these bottles come in and all the crates and, you know, it was steam powered. And you had the Packard Grape Juice Company. So it was a real industry and people were real intrigued about it. And, you know, most of what's been written about it is not here in Tryon. Most of this stuff is in newspapers in Charlotte and newspapers in Nashville, you know, talking about this phenomenon.
How long did that last? And Mike, isn't it right that the native Scuppernong and Muscadine grapes were great for making jelly? But they were not good table grapes necessarily.
They were not good table grapes, exactly.
So that's why we were not shipping.
But you know what's really fascinating, Julie? People were so used to Scuppernong wine
Yes.
that they thought Scuppernong was the good stuff.
Right.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
And these guys were growing Niagara.
Yeah.
Well, see, the idea wasn't to make wine out of Niagara. It was to make the grape juice. Yeah. And then the second was the Delaware. And I remember George saying, God, I'd love to have some of those Delawares again. They were so good. They're a pink grape. They're quite small and they're just luscious. And you just eat them for dessert. They're so good. And you can make a dessert wine out of it. Yes, Skip.
If you see the, I think it's a Scuppernong vine on the Outer Banks, it's the oldest, I think the oldest grapevine in the country.
I don't doubt
It
it.
is.
I think so, yeah.
It spreads out for hundreds. And
It's
it's Duke Power Company.
They've been making wine in the South since the early 1700s.
Yeah, it was,
Yeah.
I think some of the first wine bottled in the country was over here.
Okay.
So if there's any takeaway for docents is, no, it wasn't about the wine. It's more interesting than that.
Yes.
Now, as a little transition between our grapes and our toy makers, want to talk about the new era. Anybody ever heard of this book? The New Era. Written 1893 by Josiah Strong, who of course came to Tryon because his brother William Strong lived here and was our first architect, our first degree civil engineer. They're from Ohio. William Strong designed Lanier Library, right? And many other things. So, like, they're sitting around having a Lanier Club meeting, and back then, Lanier Club was serious business.
Yeah.
Serious. I mean, you came prepared, and you were reading Shakespeare, you were reading Cicero, you were reading, this is not light stuff. When you signed up for a Lanier Library in the old days, you were there to really learn things. Well, one of the things I think this is fascinating, in 1905 they spent a couple meetings doing nothing but talking about the new era. And if you're interested in this thought about, it's called the, what is it called? The social gospel movement, that's what it was called. Josiah Strong lived in New York. He was nationally known as a philosopher, as a preacher. His two daughters, Marjorie and the other one, lived on Melrose Circle in the house that Ellen and Harriet Peoples own now.
Yeah.
That was built for them. And then across the street was Lydia Strong and William Strong's house. So everybody around here, pretty much, kind of went along with what this philosophy was. That as good Christian people, we have a mission to make the world better. Another theme in the new era that was greatly bothering people was that the rural areas of America were emptying out and the cities were growing like wildfire. And the cities were hotbeds of crime and sin and saloons
And debauchery.
and Roman Catholics and Polish people. All those scary things. And so what needed to was that we needed to make the countryside attractive. And that was part of it. You see where I'm going with this? Is that here in our little rural communities, we would develop all the culture and civilization and refinement of the city without all of those problems. And so,
Oh my goodness.
what was the Lanier Library about? What was the
Apologies.
Tryon Opera House about? What were these private academies about? The Baron von Calden, who had a private academy, and Alice Missildine, and all those people who had, Mima Fassett had, she was from Maine. You had to start French when you were in first grade, when you enrolled at the academy up here at Pinecrest. This was about creating all the good stuff about the city while you live in the country. Tryon was supposed to be a laboratory for making America a better place and showing that you could live well in a small place. So anyway, no time to talk about that, but it's an interesting one if you want to look at it. Now, we want to talk about Toymakers, right?
Please.
Please talk about Toymakers. Okay, I am not really going to talk about my book. It's easily available here. Here's a docent copy.
Right.
When you're here and there aren't any visitors, dive in. It's really
It's excellent.
interesting. And so no need to repeat that.
No need to plug his book, but I will plug it.
Okay, that's good. Now, why did Vance and Yale come here? Was it to make toys?
No.
No. That isn't why they came here. They came with a social purpose. Same as the great people. They wanted to help the children. And the children who were not going to go to college and weren't going to become doctors and lawyers, what were they supposed to do?
Farmers?
The farm or the mill.
The farm or the mill,
That was it.
exactly. And they were among many people who said that isn't good enough. The mills were pretty bad, There was no future there. The farm wasn't that great either.
I was just gonna say.
Both my parents grew up on farms, and they decided we want to get to the city. It was okay if you were really well off and you had, other people to do the work. But ordinary, I don't need to belabor this. So, they had been working at Biltmore, and they had done the carvings like that. And there was a lady in Tryon, and everybody knew about Tryon, and her name was Margaret Morley. Is there anybody here who does not know who Margaret Morley was? Oh my gosh, okay. Her most famous book was The Carolina Mountains, 1913. Chapters on our part of the state. It was very well written. It was illustrated with her own photographs, and then she was nationally known as an author of books for children about the birds and bees. Literally, about reproduction.
We have one over here.
Yeah, I mean, they're really neat.
Seed baby.
And seed babies. And it kind of goes through the genera and kind of goes up to mammals, and then it, you know, it kind of stops short of how babies happen. But, you know, America was getting very urbanized, and the children did not see how the animals do it. And so she was, in Victorian times, helping out the urban parents with how you tell the story of life. And she made quite a reputation and quite a bit of money. And she came here with her partner, another woman, and lived on Melrose Avenue and was one of the wheels here. She was a noted national author.
Which house on Melrose? Maybe some
It
people.
is on the site of where the Congregational Annex is now.
Yeah, yeah.
The Kale's house, the gray stone house, that was built to replace where she and Constance Snow lived in the 20s. So Margaret traveled all over the world, and one of the places she went on one of her many vacations abroad was St. Ulrich in the South Tyrol, which at that time was part of Austria and is now part of Italy. Anybody been to Bolzano, where the Iceman is? Okay. Well, if you go up to the Selva ski area, you go right through St. Ulrich to get there. And it was one of the noted toy-making villages of Europe for a long time. She gets back from a trip and she decides to write a book called Donkey John of the Toy Valley, which remained in print for a quarter century. And it's this romantic story about how everybody's happy in the Alpine village because the whole family gets together and makes toys. And they're self-sufficient, and it's really sweet and wonderful. And the children learn how, and you know, and it's just wonderful. So she wrote this book that was a perennial favorite about how great the toy making is. What I think is so fascinating is about who it is dedicated to. She's sitting over here on Melrose in 1909, and she's finishing up her book, and she dedicates it to Jessie Bross Lloyd. Does anybody know who that is? Wife of William Demarest Lloyd. Ring a bell? Anybody? William Demarest Lloyd was this big muckraking figure in the progressive movement. William Demarest Lloyd. He was a socialist.
Oh, no.
Lions and tigers and socialists.
And Jessie, who had been a great friend of Margaret up there in New England, was the daughter of the founder of the Chicago Tribune newspaper. And so Jessie had it pretty easy, pretty good. But Jessie was a social reformer, and she loved to help the less fortunate. And she was really sweet and wonderful. And she knew Jane Addams. Everybody knows who Jane Addams was. Hull House. Brought her down here, brought Jane Addams down here. You know, these people were coming to Tryon. They were coming here. So that's who the book is. If you didn't get what this is about, the dedication in 1909 would make it abundantly clear that there's a lesson here. We got to keep the kids out of the mills. So, after Mr. Vanderbilt died in Asheville, Vance and Yale, who were partners, came down here and came here with the purpose of helping people. They did not come here really to make toys. That was not the original idea. But as soon as they got here, World War I started. The toys from South Tyrol were no longer available. They were on the Austrian side. The German toys were not available. The really cool toys, that you bought in New York City, the rich people, were not available from Europe. The successor to this heritage is sitting amongst us and can tell us much more. But anyway, the purpose was a social purpose. Their original organization made the toys and also did embroidery and sewing and stuff from cotton that was grown right here in Polk County. There were some farmers down in Green Creek area who were growing cotton when they came. This had not traditionally been a cotton area. The prices were so low, people, on cotton that you could hardly make any money. It was just subsistence. And so the idea was to train girls on how to more value added with the cotton. You know, how to weave it, how to sew it, how to make curtains. They taught them these things. And it didn't work out too well, but it was a noble purpose. And but then this toy thing took off because the times were right. And the toys were great. Now, so, you know that Margaret went to St. Ulrich. When you next go to Italy, you should go there. I did. They have a museum in St. Ulrich.
I'll hold that for you.
Here, I'll do it. And I picked up the book, and you start looking at this thing, and you say, wait a minute, those are Tryon toys.
Exactly.
They're Tryon toys. Whoa, whoa! Little horses on wheels, little tops, these little slider guys. So when I went to St. Ulrich, I found the last toy maker, and I said, you know, I'm from Tryon. She says, we know about Tryon. We know all about you guys.
They do.
Good to meet you. And I said, well, you know, my grandma made the toys. I said, oh, really? And she opened up her cabinet, and she showed me Grandma's toys. And I said, would you replicate any of Grandma's toys? She said, sure, for a price. So this is one I got made. By the last toy maker. It is the spitting image of what was made in Tryon. It has her mark.
Oh, wonderful.
So nobody can sell this as a knockoff Tryon toy.
Oh.
But it really is. And then, as you know from the book, they made the tops. When they spun around, the little arms fly out. This was not painted in Tryon. Is it good? Is it good? Is it as good as yours?
Steady hand.
Pretty damn good.
Pretty bad. German-Italian painters, they're
Yeah, wonderful.
good. Chuck Herring gave me this.
Ah, yes.
I've never shown it to you, Julian.
Yeah, I have her sisters and brother.
It's a model. It's not a finished toy.
Look at that.
This is an example of the quality of the painting that was being done in Tryon. Look at that.
The detail.
And so this is a model that they're learning to imitate. It's just so fun.
Could you put it in front of the camera?
These were great toys. Did you get this one? I mean, these were world class. There was nowhere else in America
Show Ellen
that
this
they were,
one too.
okay.
Yeah, demonstrate that for Ellen.
So, you know, Tryon was pretty unusual, pretty interesting place, where people were doing terrific things. And they weren't just doing it for the money, they were doing it to make it good.
You're losing your
Help
hearts
people.
here.
Yeah, that rest here.
When you were talking about the cotton, was Valhalla Weavers, was that?
That was not associated with the Toymakers, no. In fact, a lot of what Valhalla made was kind of selling what other people made. And they even brought it from other states. The 176 became quite a highway. And, you know, in the early days, everybody came by rail. But by the 20s, a lot of the people were coming here by motor car. And so the beautiful scenery between here and Saluda was a big draw. And there were a number of interesting businesses on 176.
My mother and I moved here in the 60s, and the freeway hadn't been built yet. And so the only route was 176, and all the trucks went up 176. It's a lot nicer now.
Yeah, we can have a whole museum just on the Toymakers. We really could. The Tryon Toymakers and wood carvers and what they produced was wonderful. Oh, one thing to mention about that. Not all the carved wood you see is Tryon Toymakers, by any means. They did not copyright their designs. They didn't even mind if people knocked it off. I was in someone's house, built in the 20s, not long ago. He says, "How do you like my Tryon Toymakers mantle?"
And what did Mike say?
And I said, "Could be." Personally, I think it's Frank Arthur's work.
Yeah.
Frank Arthur had worked for Vance and Yale in Asheville, and then came down here and worked for them here, and then he went out on his own with their blessing and taught other people. Lynn Code, we know for sure, you know, as fine a house as was ever built. We know for sure that Frank Arthur did the carving there. Wayne Kreisman was very good.
Yeah.
Wayne had also worked in Asheville for Biltmore State Industries, and you're smiling. He was such a character. I mean, he was just really a character.
Great character.
Very, very skilled, very interesting guy.
Mike, can you mention some of the
Yeah, can you
Holy
explain some
Cross
of this?
Episcopal Church and Congregational Church? Some of
Get old. And the Depression came. And in the 1930s, the market for these expensive things went away. And really, Vance and Yale were not wealthy people. And so they built the chalet with the money they had left, employing people who needed work. I mean, this is another example of people really trying to do a good thing. They didn't hoard their money. They built, I mean, there were houses for sale here that you could buy for a song. But they spent it, you know, employing people. Farmers Federation was trying to help people in Western North Carolina, and it was going to go completely out. And again, this theme of the social gospel that providing dignified employment to people is important was one of the goals of the Farmers Federation, which was a non-profit organization.
And about what year was that, Mike?
36?
46, I think.
During the
And
Depression?
it's in my book.
Yeah, yeah.
So the Farmers Federation came in, acquired all the assets of the Tryon Toymakers, and granted them a little pension. And you know how acquiring people are, they always can do better, and the old people didn't know what they were doing.
Yeah.
Well, they got a hold, they said, we can't make any money at this thing. And they were paying boys like Harold Taylor like 10 cents an hour, you know, I mean, they were, and they couldn't make any money out of it. So then there was a man named Richards Brooks. His first name was Richards, who was a wealthy retiree from Argentina. And he was really from Philadelphia, but he'd made his money in Argentina. And he lived in Gillette Woods. So he kind of bought out the Farmers Federation contract. And this was a smart businessman with plenty of money. And he couldn't make it make money either. And then there was a fire. And they bought the old paper box factory that was which by the way, was probably first built to present grapes in.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
Right by the railroad.
And, you know, it was an obsolete plant down here by the tracks, and it just burned down with everything in it. So there wasn't any objective reason to try to get it going again. It was shut. So they got their little business back, but they didn't have any pension or anything. It was kind of sad.
Yeah.
They weren't eligible for Social Security because they hadn't contributed to it. And in their last years, I mean, Vance and Yale lived to 54 and 58, so they were getting along on practically nothing.
Yeah.
Well, Mr. and Ms. Moss Gilbert owned it then.
They bought it in 49.
Yeah,
He bought
in
it.
49, they
Yards
sold,
over the hill, you know, not over there.
yeah, the building was sold to Moss Gilbert from Dedham, Massachusetts, and Mayville,
He did the cutting and she did the painting.
yeah.
Mhm.
But essentially, they just bought the real estate. The,
Were
I
there,
don't think they had the mark on the toys either. When
Now, there was a period of time when you will find a paper label with the Toy House on it. Tell them about that era,
yeah, that was their mark.
yeah.
They dropped wood carvers, because they weren't carvers. And they made a much simpler and more updated kind of product. And it was actually very attractive.
Was it still a toy?
They did a
Pardon?
great
Was it
job.
still a toy? Or
Yeah.
was it just
Yeah,
something else?
just
There were
the
toys,
toys,
puzzles,
Yeah,
there was a rocking horse
Rocking
thing,
horse.
they designed some of their new things.
Yeah.
They updated the business. And it was a retirement business for them.
Mike,
Mike,
which time period was the catalog?
which one?
Well, was there always a catalog?
No, there was
No.
not usually a
No, there
catalog.
usually wasn't one.
The first real catalog
Nancy did.
one that came out in the 30s.
Okay.
When things really got bad. And so if you look in my book, you'll see an example in color of a beautiful catalog that was designed by Galafox Press in Asheville.
Okay. Was that Chuck and Nancy, or was it before then?
What one? What?
Who
Before Chuck.
owned the Toymaker franchise, if you will, when the catalog was being
Vance and
produced?
Yale.
Fancy, yeah, because it was the
Oh.
30s. How
How long
has
was
the
the
cuts
We
from?
printed it, and I still have the cuts for it.
Yeah, he saw his
Wow.
cuts for it. So they did do one, but it wasn't like one of those things where you had an annual catalog every, or something. It wasn't, like Chuck and Nancy did a color one when they owned it.
Oh, you're, okay. Let me help the whole group here.
Yes.
You've brought up Chuck and Nancy. So after, my mind, Moss Gilbert
Yeah.
and his second wife transitioned out, then Charles Heron, who's still alive in Saluda, and his first wife, who doesn't live in Saluda, started a Tryon Toymakers business.
And that was when?
About 70?
78.
Yeah, I was here when I came in '83.
Yeah, and it was right before Moss died. And there was sort of some overflow of what Moss was doing to what they were doing. They picked up more on what he was doing than the early ones.
The somersaulting rabbit was just really great.
Oh, yeah, that's correct.
Did Moss invent the somersaulting rabbit?
I have seen one before Moss bought the business. before
I think
49.
maybe Vance and Yale did
I
that,
think
but
they
I'm not
did.
sure.
Because what I'm doing, are the designs that Miss Vance and Miss Yale were doing from the beginning.
We had a
Like
big show in
used,
2004 at Fine Arts Center. Anybody here go there on the Toymakers? It was a fabulous show.
Thank you.
And at the time, we had the noble goal of writing the comprehensive book about Toymakers. And we would show everything they ever did. And so what you read today, my little thing was going to be the first chapter
Yeah.
introducing that. The rest of the book never got written. Never will.
We sort
It
of,
is
sort of
so.
haven't gotten around to that
The
yet.
We
subject is just
appreciate this
huge.
greatly because these are really,
Well, you know, and I just get tickled when somebody drags something in and we've never seen it before.